So I'm Daniel. This is the policy Affs topic analysis for the standardized tests September-October topic. So first, a brief overview. So there are kind of two major tests that come to mind for college exams, the SAT and the ACT. There are also some other ones that could be useful to construct affirmatives, exit exams, so tests like the CHESP, which are the equivalent of a GED and could be used as a requirement to get into college because you do need some type of terminal high school degree to go to university. The TOEFL, which isn't required for domestic applicants, but is a test of kind of mastery over the English language for international applicants, and AP tests, whose kind of main focus is not admissions, but can be used to kind of gauge a student's readiness for college. And so colleges are already phasing out kind of standardized testing. And one problem with affirmatives on here is that there are already around 1,000 or so colleges that no longer have standardized testing. And so the problem with that is a lot of affirmatives with kind of brink arguments. So think kind of big stick Affs that have this is not happening right now. If this causes it, something bad happens. Those lose a lot of uniqueness because negatives can always make the argument that almost half of universities have already phased this out. And so if the advantage hasn't happened or begun to happen, then it's unlikely it'll happen if the other colleges follow suit. A good way to resolve this as a general strategy thing is to create structural arguments. And so the way that those would look would be, instead of having not happening now, but the plan causes it to happen or something like that, you would have some type of argument like racism or sexism that's more structural, and you would target kind of a specific population that was kind of affected by this. And the reason why these resolve those arguments is because instead of because there's no affirmative that can solve all racism, but kind of doing specific institutional actions that are able to lessen that or make the quality of life better for some people is something that the affirmative can do. Now, obviously, the trade-off here is that you get kind of a clearer solvency picture. There's a better reason why the affirmative solves something, but there's less of an impact, right? So this is kind of where soft left Affs come more in, because there isn't as much kind of room to work with for more big stick type extinction level, global warming, Affs like that, like we've seen on some previous topics. So another problem is the actor in general is normally some type of government or has some type of moral prescription. But this one specifies private colleges and universities. And so the federal government, state governments, and local governments have really limited control over what they can do, because private universities are really private entities. So the government can't just come in with a bunch of regulations. There are kind of a couple of laws, such as kind of Title IX and things like that, which do regulate the way that colleges and universities work. But the kind of way the way that those laws work is that instead of actual regulations that are enforceable, governments just condition government funding on compliance with those regulations. So there are actually some universities, for example, that don't comply with Title IX and just refuse federal funding. And so the actor for this government is most likely, for this topic, is most likely going to be private colleges and universities, just because of their decentralized nature. So it's hard to find kind of Affs that aren't effects topical or extra topical or just not topical at all that would use some type of government or agency body. So that kind of leads into the next slide, right? Colleges and universities are the generic argument. They're the ones that have the most obvious actor. But if there's some way to resolve effects topicality, or to answer it, and effects topicality just says that instead of the affirmative mandating something, the effect of a plan mandates something, right? So instead of colleges and universities actually getting rid of standardized testing, the affirmative mandates something that would then force colleges and universities to adopt the resolution or the plan. If those types of affirmatives could be better if we wanted to use the government. So kind of the two main governmental actors on this topic are, the United States federal government, which could do affirmatives such as conditioning federal funding on rejecting the SAT or ACT as admission, kind of in their undergraduate admissions. The 50 states could also do something. The way to get around effects topicality with the 50 states would be to limit affirmatives only to state universities, because state legislators have some type of power over what state universities can and cannot do, because they are funded by the government and taxpayer money, etc. One way to start with that actor and then move on is to make some type of follow-on argument. So follow-on is exactly what it sounds like, right? Person A does something and then someone else literally models or follows on to that. So there's a lot of research that says that when the University of California system does something, other universities, particularly other kind of public universities or small private universities, tend to follow it just because it's such a large kind of system, and the UCs and the CSEs together have like 800,000 students or something, so it kind of creates ripple effects that could give you some of those larger impacts that require all colleges and universities to act while limiting the actor to the 50 states. And there are a couple benefits to those that we'll get into later. So the kind of first type of AF is a big stick AF, right? And these are affirmatives with larger impacts that are usually based in utilitarian calculus, so things like nuclear war, hegemony, economic decline, things like that. So kind of a good generic affirmative on this is just the econ hedge AF. It doesn't matter what the actor uses or which actor it is, but the way it would work would be that standardized testing doesn't correctly sort kind of the best and brightest students. And so standardized testing is what in economics is known as a differentiating mechanism, because there are incentives for people to hide information about how smart they really are, or the kind of imperfect nature of society makes it hard to truly gauge that. Standardized testing is something that people can take to create a signal of their kind of capability relative to other people. So the argument that this leads into is that because of the nature of standardized testing, its time, its structure, things like that, it doesn't lead to a good differentiating mechanism. For example, there's evidence out there that it's not standardized testing doesn't correctly predict GPA in college and things like that. And so what that does is it inefficiently allocates kind of people to universities, right? So there are people who might be more capable who just can't take standardized tests, who end up not getting into the best universities. And this creates misallocation of what in economics is called kind of human capital, right? The country's total capital stock, which makes it harder for us to technologically develop, to do things like develop new technology, which ultimately doesn't increase the economy. So the kind of econ advantage here would less be based on economic decline, so to speak, because there are those problems with brink impacts and already phasing out problems we talked about earlier, but it would be more of a slow growth argument. For example, we are achieving 1 or 2% growth now. We could be achieving 5% in a world where we had differentiating mechanisms that weren't the SAT or the ACT. The second type of advantage would be the hedge affirmative, right? So this, I think, a good internal link story for this is based on the TOEFL, because that disincentivizes foreign students to come abroad just because there are high kind of sunk costs, right, to learning a foreign language. You have to spend a lot of time mastering arcane vocabulary, understanding grammar, things like that, which means that a lot of students who would have come to the United States might go to other countries or stay in their home country, especially as the U.S. university system, for a myriad of reasons, is gradually beginning to lose its power. And so what abolishing the TOEFL could do would be it could send signals to international students that decrease the barrier of entry for them to apply, which could increase the number of kind of university-level students who come to the U.S. And there's research that says that when they come to the U.S. for undergrad, a lot of them stay. And what this does is it has a dual effect, because it kind of attracts the smartest people from other countries to the United States, and it keeps them there. So we get smarter people while other countries lose smart people. And so this causes us to be able to develop economically, technologically, kind of militarily faster than other countries, which makes it easier for us to maintain our relative hegemony, kind of technological superiority, military readiness over other countries. And so that's what would allow for kind of maintenance of U.S. hegemony. And the problem with this affirmative is mostly that because of the nature of education, the impacts would be longer term, right? So there wouldn't really be a noticeable effect on economic growth or U.S. hegemony for maybe a decade after the plan occurs, which means that there's a time frame problem, but there's a good magnitude argument, right? So these asks take a long time to happen, but their impacts cause extinction. So it would kind of set up an affirmative where the 2AR is very impact calc heavy, partially because of the weak nature of internal links. There are a lot of maybe other reasons why U.S. hegemony is good, etc. And And so because of that, this affirmative, right, with the hedge would have to have a good answer to the effects topicality problem we discussed earlier, and be very heavily focused on impact calculus and the TOAR. The second affirmative that might be considered a big stick affirmative is an affirmative that has to do with military academies. So the U.S. funds, the U.S. federal government, right, is in charge of a couple of universities, the Naval Academy, the Military Academy, West Point, other institutions like that. And right now, a key kind of thing that they require are physical entrance tests. And so this is one of those maybe quote-unquote standardized tests that weren't discussed at the beginning. Because a standardized test is really just any test that uses a set of objective criteria to give you some type of measurement of yourself, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a test of intellect. It can be any test of skill, any test of skill, right? So physical tests that are required to get into places like West Point, for example, you have to run a mile in a certain amount of time, could also be considered standardized tests. So this Aff can be spun in two ways. So the first way is using this interpretation of physical tests and saying that this requirement for physical tests creates this environment where physical brawn is prioritized over any type of intellect for people who go to places like West Point or the Naval Academy, which creates kind of ripple effects, because these are the people who command the U.S. military, where they have this, where instead of thinking tactically and strategically, because that they think, they focus more on building muscles, running miles in a certain amount of times, etc., and that creates inefficiencies in the military system that decimates military capacity. And that kind of decimation of military capacity is what destroys U.S. hegemony. Now, this isn't exactly what's said on the slide, because this affirmative can also go the other way, right? You can say that physical tests for entrance are the only thing that allow America to maintain its U.S. hegemony, because that's what allows for teams like SEAL Team 6, etc., to go into other countries and essentially flex U.S. military superiority on other countries. And so banning those types of physical entrance exams remove this type of physical differentiating capability in U.S. military kind of academies, not just in tactical ones like West Point, but every single one where recruitment is necessary. And that causes the ultimate decline of U.S. hegemony. And you can make some impacts for why U.S. hegemony is bad. There are kind of soft left arguments like in exploitation, maybe a capitalism affirmative. There's also a big stick version where you have things like opaque proliferation. Opaque proliferation is the idea that when there's one global superpower, states that superpower explicitly identify as an enemy. For example, North Korea or Iran have an incentive to develop nuclear weapons without other countries knowing, because they don't have a strong ally to protect themselves, which increases the probability that those nuclear weapons get in the hands of terrorists or are misused themselves because of miscalculation. And so I actually kind of did the hedge good version before the hedge bad version, but those are the two kind of hedge apps. Now, obviously, this affirmative has some of the same problems as the other big stick app in that the impact is very large, but there's a time frame problem, and there's a probability problem with the kind of length and strength of the internal links. And so these would be kind of those types of affirmatives, or it might take 2 or 3 hours to find a single card. But that's true on the negative as well. So this would be more of an impact debate than any type of topic debate. So the next types of affirmatives are the soft left apps. And these will be most likely the core of the topic. They don't require any specific actor, and they deal with a lot of the, I guess, more topical problems, or problems evident in the lit base with the current, with standardized testing. So the first one obviously has to do with capitalism and inequality. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of conclusive evidence that says that the richer someone gets, the higher their SAT score is, controlling for other factors such as intellect or future potential, etc. And so this argument is that standardized testing is a tool that locks in systemic inequality, essentially, right? Because if you're richer, you get a higher SAT score. If that can be used in college admissions, you get to go to a better college, you have a higher earning potential, etc. All of which kind of aggregates and actually makes worse this kind of bifurcated class cycle, right? So there's where you have a really rich class that can afford test prep, can afford tutors, that scores really well on the SAT, and you have a lot of people who don't have the time, don't have the energy, don't have the means, right, to purchase these services, and so they aren't able to achieve the same thing. The impact of this would most likely be something like mass inequality. There's good Giroux evidence and some other kind of leftist authors that talk about what the essentially what the impacts to inequality are. They do good impact calculus on those. The other way that you could take this affirmative is if you find evidence, which exists, that says that inequality actually increases the possibility of economic decline. And there's a whole host of economic warrants for this, including kind of things like liquidity, which is the theory of how fast money goes through the economy. And then you could turn it essentially into an economic decline bad affirmative. The second type of soft left affirmative on this topic is the disabilities affirmative, right? So there's a lot of literature about how kind of standardized testing, number one, prioritizes and promotes this ideal version of like a super neurotypical, super intellectual person, and how those are the ones that deserve to be rewarded with a higher earning potential, a better education, etc., right? And two, how the structure of standardized testing itself is ableist. It kind of requires certain things that make it inaccessible to non-neurotypical individuals. And so either of those internal links is a good reason why getting rid of standardized testing would be able to kind of resolve this type of systemic inequality. And the argument kind of here, as it is with most of the other soft left affirmatives, isn't that getting rid of standardized testing resolves all ableism in the status quo, or resolves all capitalism in the status quo, or all racism, but instead it's more of a generic argument that's like, doing this one thing that helps this one subset of people is just a good thing, right? The analogy to this is getting rid of Brown versus Board of Education didn't solve all racism, but it did stop a specific proximate manifestation of that racism, which was still good, and that's the reason why the affirmative is good. And so some examples of this might be the way that standardized testing creates environments that are bad for people who are dyslexic or have ADHD or have physical impediments that make it difficult for them to take these types of standardized testing, and how using those as signals in undergraduate admissions makes it impossible for non-neurotypical bodies to have access to those institutions, which is kind of the ultimate form of ableism, right? The last type of affirmative is kind of a psychological trauma affirmative. And at this point, I'm going to put in a short content warning. There will be discussions of kind of depression and things like that for the next 1 or 2 minutes in the presentation. So feel free to skip over this section if that's something that you need to do. Yeah. Okay, so with that being said, the psychological trauma version of the soft left affirmative would say that, for example, the anxiety and stress caused by standardized testing can cause a lot of people to be to fall into this type of depression, right? That can even culminate in things like self-harm or suicide. On the policy topic 2 years ago, Monte Vista actually cut this card that says that because of high-stakes standardized testing, so things like the SAT or the ACT, up to 4,000 kids attempt to commit suicide every year. And so this is a very clear-cut impact. It has a lot of impact calculus, and the argument is relatively intuitive. Standardized testing causes this type of anxiety, which hurts the mental health of students, especially high school students. So getting rid of standardized testing would resolve that issue. The one problem I can see with this affirmative is just the thumpers that come with it, because there are other forms of high-stakes testing, like AP tests for college credit or high kind of state tests that the affirmative wouldn't be able to get rid of. But there's definitely kind of a sliding scale type argument that could be made on this. That could be a reason why this would still be a good idea. All right, the last type of affirmative are those that are questionably topical. So they would have advantages not based on things like we've talked about earlier, based on the actual effects of the plan, but based on the process that they occur. So the advantage to having questionably topical affirmatives is that you have built-in disadds to any type of counterplan. Because what you're saying is that the affirmative itself, the process of the affirmative happening is a good idea, and any counterplan that doesn't do the same thing as the affirmative can't achieve that, right? So most of these could be based on legal precedents that could be created by durable fiat. One example would be a state's affirmative. So a state court's affirmative that has all 50 states uniformly rule on something with regards to kind of education or regulation of private universities could be good for 2 reasons, right? So the first would be some type of federalism benefit. You can make the argument that all 50 states ruling on something strengthens educational federalism, which serves as a model to strengthen federalism as a whole. And these advantages usually have to deal with the way that states can deal with warming under a Trump presidency. or modeling advantages. So countries like Nigeria or Iraq that are setting up baby democracies right now look to the U.S. system of federalism. So strengthening federalism allows for decentralization in those countries that could resolve certain tensions, right? So in Nigeria, the north is very Muslim, the south is very Catholic, and that creates a lot of tensions between those places. So decentralization, so a less strong central government in a state like Nigeria could be better for its long-term stability. This type of the internal link would obviously be that it's an increase in state power by allowing them to rule on the regulations that have to do with private universities, especially maybe using things like funding as carrots, because that's traditionally been more of a federal government type thing, for example, with Title IX, and that could be the process advantage. The second process advantage could be some type of state's politics decide, and so what that would be something, for example, like the fact that this type of getting rid of standardized testing is controversial because it creates the entire America is a meritocracy type argument, which is polarizing for people, which drains political capital in certain states. So you can make arguments that have to deal with some state politics decides that are salient that come to mind have to deal with the popular vote initiative. So in states like Nevada or Maine, where they were recently vetoed but passed Congress, and you can make arguments that say that getting rid of the Electoral College resolves democracy. There are also things that are happening in California right now, like reapproving the carbon tax, maybe the possible repeal of the gas tax, things like that. The second type of affirmative is a federal funding act that operates very much in the same way, but the opposite, right? So a lot of these affirmatives can go both ways because they're very impact-driven like affirmatives. So the federal funding affirmative would condition funding of private universities on getting rid of undergraduate admissions criteria. And this is a massive expansion of federal power that could allow the federal government to do a lot of things. The way I kind of see this working out the best is instead of Congress doing it, having the executive do it, because that could increase executive ability to interpret statutes, because durable fiat, which is the idea that the affirmative can't get repealed, might force the court to rule in certain ways that can expand federal power. Which kind of leads into the last type of affirmative, the DOE affirmative. This would have some argument that says that standardized testing ruins equal opportunity, ruins some type of statute for equal opportunity. So maybe it violates like the 14th Amendment or anything that kind of the Supreme Court has been ruling on lately with affirmative action. You can make spillover arguments that say that if the DOE acts on this way, there are two process advantages that jump to mind. The first is that it could be an expansion of Chevron deference. So what Chevron deference is it allows the ability of the federal agencies to reinterpret statutes when those statutes are kind of, if those reinterpretations don't necessarily directly contradict anything that was explicitly written in the mandate for Congress. And so what that means is basically if Congress writes a law that's kind of vague, as Congress sometimes does, there's a lot of administrative ability to create whatever it wants to fill in those gray spots, where it can do anything that is in the realm of the legislation without necessarily directly contradicting it. And so this act allows the executive to reinterpret a lot of different things and create a lot of executive guidelines or regulations. And there are arguments for why that's good, there are arguments for why that's bad, and so this affirmative can work either way. The second argument is that if the DOE does this, the courts have to uphold that, which is a massive expansion of the ability for, and the language that would be required in that court ruling would be a massive expansion of civil rights, which could spill over to a whole host of things. So the built-in soft left impact, there are arguments that this increases U.S. credibility worldwide, which allows for more international cooperation on issues, and there are even spillover arguments for why this would increased U.S. human rights credibility to give it more negotiating capital or diplomatic capital across the world. There are a lot of fun things that can be done with the different mechanisms and interpretations of durable fiat. And so with that in mind, these are kind of some of the affirmatives that might be run, will be core of the topic, and might be fun to read in maybe an elimination round. Yeah, if you have any questions about this, feel free to Slack me or message me or anything like that. And